Consider, for a moment, the fragility of the world we built. In the year 2013, human civilization stood at what appeared to be its zenith. 7 billion souls inhabited a planet wrapped in invisible threads of connection. Information traveled at the speed of light. A person in Tokyo could speak face to face with someone in London. Goods manufactured on one continent arrived on another within days. We had conquered distance, tamed disease, and built cities that scraped the sky itself. We believed ourselves masters of our domain, architects of an unstoppable future. We were spectacular in our complexity. Power grids hummed with electricity, feeding the veins of cities that never slept. Supply chains moved food from farm to table through networks of breathtaking efficiency. Governments coordinated across borders. Scientists decoded the very language of life itself, reading genes like ancient texts that revealed our deepest origins. We had walked on the moon. We had photographed the edge of the observable universe. We were gods in our own eyes, and the earth was our garden. But here is what we had forgotten. Nature is patient. Nature is relentless. And nature, unlike humanity, does not build according to our convenience. Deep in the soil, in the decomposing matter of fallen trees and dying insects, there exists a kingdom as old as the forests themselves. Fungi, the great decomposers, the recyclers of life. They break down what dies and return it to the earth, completing cycles that have turned for hundreds of millions of years. They communicate through vast underground networks, sharing nutrients across miles of forest floor. They are, in many ways, the planet's immune system, breaking down the old to make room for the new. Among these ancient organisms lives a genus called Cordyceps. Perhaps you've seen the photographs. An ant, frozen in death, clinging to a leaf, while a grotesque stalk erupts from its head like some nightmare flower. These fungi are parasites of extraordinary sophistication. They invade an insect's body, consume it from within, and then most remarkably hijack its nervous system. The infected ant climbs, compelled by fungal commands, to an optimal height and position. There it dies, clamped in place, while the fungus fruits from its skull, releasing spores to rain down upon new victims below. It is evolution's dark poetry. The ant becomes a vehicle, its behavior no longer its own, puppeted by an organism that has learned to rewrite neural code for its own reproduction. Scientists had studied Cordyceps for decades, marveling at its precision, secure in one fundamental assumption: the fungi that parasitized insects were locked to their hosts by millions of years of coevolution. They could not jump to mammals. They certainly could not infect humans. Our body temperature alone, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, served as a natural fortress against such invasion. But the Earth was warming. Imagine a lock and a key separated by an invisible barrier. For millions of years, that barrier held firm. But gradually, incrementally, the temperature rose. 0.5 degree. 2 degrees. And somewhere in the soil, in the endless genetic lottery of mutation and reproduction, a variety of cordyceps found itself tolerating heat it had never survived before. The barrier thinned. The impossible became merely improbable. The improbable became, on September 26, 2013, inevitable. We do not know the name of patient zero. Perhaps they were a farmer in South America, working soil rich with fungal spores. Perhaps a researcher, unlucky in a moment of carelessness. Perhaps a child, playing where children should not play. What we know is this: the infection took hold. The fungus, adapted through countless generations to commandeer nervous systems, found human neurons no different in their fundamental architecture than an insect's. It spread through the bloodstream. It crossed the blood-brain barrier, and it began to grow. The first symptoms appeared benign enough: confusion, disorientation, a fever that burned but did not kill. But within hours, the infected became something else. The fungus infiltrated their brain tissue, consuming, rewiring, reprogramming. Higher reasoning dissolved, memory faded. What remained was base instinct twisted toward a single purpose: spread the infection, bite, scratch, transmit the spores that now bloomed from every infected cell. The mathematics of exponential growth are merciless. One infected person transmits to two, two become 4, 4 become 16, 16 become 256. Within a week, patient zero's infection had reached thousands. Within 2 weeks, major cities reported outbreaks. Within 3 weeks, governments declared states of emergency. Within a month, civilization was fighting for its life. Consider the interconnection that had seemed our greatest achievement. Those supply chains that moved goods across continents now moved infection with the same ruthless efficiency. Air travel, the miracle that made the world small, carried spores from continent to continent before authorities even knew to look. Cities, dense with humanity, became perfect breeding grounds. The very concentration that made urban life possible made pandemic spread inevitable. The scenes from those first days remain seared in collective memory. Airports transformed into quarantine zones overnight. Travelers herded into detention areas as health workers in hazmat suits moved among them like astronauts on an alien world. Highways became parking lots as millions fled cities, only to spread infection to rural areas that had moments before seemed safely distant. Hospitals overflowed. Then they fell silent as doctors and nurses joined the infected. Power grids failed as operators abandoned their posts. Communication networks collapsed as cell towers went unmaintained. Humanity fought back. Of course we did. We are not a species that surrenders easily. Police and military personnel, those who had sworn oaths to protect, became humanity's front line. They established cordons around infection zones. They fired on citizens who hours before they would have died to protect. They made the calculations that no training prepares you for. This building or that one. These 100 people or those 1,000. The infected child or the uninfected family sheltering behind a door that will not hold much longer. Heroes emerged in those hours. First responders who went into infected zones knowing they would not return. Doctors who stayed at bedsides as the hospital filled with screams. Parents who hid children in cabinets and attics, making themselves bait to draw infected away. Neighbors who shared their last food. Strangers who carried wounded to safety. The infected who, in their final moments of clarity, begged to be restrained or killed before they could harm others. But heroism, for all its nobility, cannot overcome biology at scale. Martial law was declared in cities across the globe. Military troops patrolled streets, once filled with commerce and laughter. Curfews were enforced with lethal authority. Anyone showing symptoms was to be reported immediately, detained, isolated. Anyone bitten was condemned. The social contract that held communities together dissolved under the weight of existential terror. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. In Austin, Texas, a man named Joel lived what he thought was an ordinary life. He was a contractor, a single father, someone who built things with his hands and loved his daughter with the fierce protectiveness that comes from raising a child alone. Sarah was 12 years old that September, bright, thoughtful, the kind of daughter who remembered her father's birthday when he forgot his own. She gave him a watch that morning, its hands counting down hours to a future they both believed would arrive. Outbreak. Day in Austin began like a whisper and ended like a scream. Joel came home late from work, exhausted, unaware that the world was ending around him. Sarah watched television as the emergency broadcast system interrupted regular programming. Reports of riots, hospitals overwhelmed, something about an infection. The kind of news that feels important but distant, happening to other people in other places, surely not here, surely not now. But it was here. It was now. The neighbor across the street began convulsing in his yard. Their elderly neighbor next door, the one who waved every morning, crashed through her own glass door, her jaw distended, her eyes vacant, fungal growth already visible on her neck. The infected moved with terrible purpose, faster than seemed possible, driven by the fungus's single imperative. They did not hunt for food. They did not kill for resources. They killed to spread infection, and they did so with a ferocity that made them nearly unstoppable. Joel grabbed Sarah. They ran. His brother Tommy arrived in his truck, and together they fled into streets that had become war zones. Cars crashed into storefronts, buildings burned, gunfire echoed from every direction. The military had established checkpoints, but they were failing, overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected pouring through residential neighborhoods. Soldiers fired into crowds, unable to distinguish the infected from the fleeing in the chaos and darkness. They reached a checkpoint. A soldier, young, terrified, received orders through his radio, orders that made him raise his rifle at a man and his daughter. Joel begged. He was holding a 12-year-old girl. She was not infected. Please, please. But the soldier had his orders. Shoot on sight. Eliminate all potential vectors. In the calculus of martial law, one child's life weighed against potential spread was not a calculation at all. The soldier fired. Joel felt Sarah's weight change in his arms, felt warmth spreading across his Paris hands, looked down to see blood, too much blood, pouring from a wound in her stomach. She looked at him with confusion, with pain, with the terrible understanding that comes in the final moments. She said his name. She asked him to fix it, the way fathers fix everything: broken toys, scraped knees, bad dreams. But this he could not fix. Sarah died in her father's arms, as civilization died around them both. The watch she had given him that morning ticked on, indifferent, counting seconds in a world where time had lost its meaning. In that moment, Joel learned what the coming years would teach millions. Everything you love can be taken in an instant. Every plan you made, every future you imagined, every version of yourself you believed was permanent. All of it is temporary. All of it is fragile. All of it can burn. The first 24 hours claimed 1 billion lives. Infrastructure that had taken centuries to build collapsed in a day. The electrical grid failed in cascading blackouts. As power plants went unattended, water treatment facilities stopped operating, turning taps dry or toxic. Communication satellites orbited uselessly above a world that could no longer maintain the ground stations to receive their signals. The internet, humanity's crowning achievement of connection, dissolved into isolated pockets of desperate messaging before dying entirely. Governments fell or retreated into fortified bunkers. Presidents and prime ministers addressed citizens who could no longer hear them. Military chains of command fractured as units lost contact with headquarters, then with each other, then with any authority beyond their immediate commanding officer. Some soldiers deserted to find family. Some followed orders until orders stopped coming. Some became warlords over whatever territory they could hold. The infected multiplied according to exponential logic, each one creating more, each new infected adding to the swarm. But they were not the only threat. Panic killed, as efficiently as infection. Riots overwhelmed police forces. Looting emptied stores. Violence erupted as resources grew scarce and social norms collapsed. People killed for gasoline, for food, for the chance to escape. Families turned on neighbors, neighbors turned on families. The thin veneer of civilization, it turned out, required constant maintenance, and when that maintenance ceased, so too did civilization. We had built a world dependent on complexity, on systems nested within systems, each requiring the next to function. When the power failed, refrigeration failed. When refrigeration failed, food supplies rotted. When food supplies rotted, people starved. When people starved, they fought. When they fought, more systems failed. The cascade was total. 20 years later, survivors would struggle to explain to those born after what was lost. How do you describe artificial light to someone who has only known fire? How do you convey the miracle of medicine to someone who has watched people die from infections that were once cured with pills? How do you explain the internet, airplanes, the ease of a life where water came from taps and food from stores, and safety from locks on doors that actually held? But in those first hours, as Sarah died and civilization burned, the survivors could not think about what was lost. They could only think about the next moment, the next breath, the next step. Joel held his daughter's body as the soldier who had shot her was himself torn apart by infected. He held her as fires spread across Austin. He held her until Tommy pulled him away, because staying meant death, and death was seductive in that moment, a release from a pain too vast to bear. But Joel did not die that night. He survived. And survival, it would turn out, was its own kind of curse. A 20-year sentence in a world transformed into something ancient and merciless, where every dawn was a victory and every night a battle, where the infection was only one of many ways to die, and where the man Joel had been the father, the builder, the one who believed in tomorrow, died with his daughter in his arms. The world that ended was not prepared for its ending. We thought we had conquered nature. We thought our intelligence, our technology, our sheer numbers made us invulnerable. But we had only ever been another species, subject to the same forces that govern all life. A fungus, following its imperative to grow and spread, had found its way across an evolutionary barrier we thought insurmountable. And in crossing that barrier, it had reduced our gleaming civilization to rubble and memory. 24 hours. That was all it took. One day to end 10,000 years of human civilization. What came after would be worse. 20 years is a lifetime for some. For others, it is a slow education in what humans become when the world stops watching. The first winter after the outbreak claimed more lives than the infection itself. Those who survived the initial chaos found themselves in a world stripped of everything that had made survival easy. No electricity meant no heat in northern climates. No refrigeration meant food spoiled within days. No supply chains meant what you had was all you would ever have until you could take more from someone else or grow it yourself with seeds you might not possess and knowledge you had never needed to acquire. Humanity contracted. The 7 billion became 3 billion, then 1 billion, then fewer still. Entire regions went dark and silent. Cities that had blazed with light became tombs where the infected wandered among skeletons and rubble. But in some places, in strategic locations with defensible geography and remaining resources, the survivors gathered. They built walls. They established order. They created something that resembled civilization, if you squinted and did not look too closely at the methods required to maintain it. The quarantine zones rose from the ashes like fortresses of last resort. These were not the cities of before. They were islands of enforced order surrounded by wilderness and death. The Federal Disaster Response Agency, FEDRA, assumed control not through democratic process, but through the simple possession of weapons, organization, and the willingness to use both without hesitation. They were military authority without civilian oversight, martial law without end date, dictatorship without apology. And for those who lived within their walls, this was preferable to the alternative. Consider the Boston Quarantine Zone, one of the largest remaining bastions of human society. Concrete walls 30 feet high surrounded a core of the old city, topped with razor wire and guard towers staffed 24 hours a day. Searchlights swept the perimeter after dark. Machine guns pointed both outward at the infected and inward at the citizens. The message was clear: you are protected, but you are also contained. Safety came with surveillance. Security came with submission. Life inside followed rigid patterns. Every resident received an identification card linked to their work assignment and ration entitlement. No card meant no food, no shelter, no medical care. The cards were scanned at checkpoints throughout the zone, creating a web of monitoring that tracked every citizen's movements. Wake at dawn. Queue for rations. Report to assigned work detail. Return before curfew. Deviate from pattern, and you drew attention. Draw attention, and you risked detention, interrogation, or worse. The work details varied, but shared common themes: backbreaking labor in service of the zone's survival. Some burned infected corpses in the furnaces that ran day and night, the smoke a constant reminder of what waited outside. Some cleared rubble, salvaging materials from the dead portions of the city. Some worked the farms established on former parks and parking lots, coaxing vegetables from soil supplemented with ash and waste. Some staffed the water purification systems, the last bulwark against disease. Some served in the security forces, becoming enforcers of the very system that controlled them. Public executions were not rare, they were routine. A platform stood in the central square, and regularly, citizens were marched up its steps. Their crimes varied: theft of rations, possession of contraband, failure to report infected family members, speaking against Fedra, attempting to leave the zone. The method was always the same. A soldier read the charges. The condemned was given no opportunity to speak. A single gunshot ended the demonstration. The body was left on display for hours, a lesson in compliance written in flesh. And yet, people adapted. Humans possess a remarkable capacity to normalize horror. After months, the executions became background noise, something you noted and then forgot, something you walked past on your way to collect rations. Children born into this world knew nothing else. They played in the shadow of guard towers. They learned to recognize the warning sirens that meant infected had breached the outer perimeter. They grew up understanding that disobedience meant death, and this seemed as natural as gravity. But beneath the surface of compliance, another economy thrived. The black market, smugglers, those who moved contraband through tunnels and weak points in the walls, who traded in goods Fedra could not or would not provide: alcohol, drugs, weapons, luxury items from the world before, information, and passage outside the zones for those desperate or foolish enough to risk the wilderness. Joel became one of these smugglers. The man who had been a father, who had built houses and kissed scraped knees and believed in tomorrow, did not survive the outbreak. That man died with Sarah. What remained was something harder, something that had learned the fundamental lesson of the new world. You survive by being willing to do what others will not. Sentiment is weakness. Trust is liability. Every person you meet is either a resource or a threat, and you must decide which before they decide about you. For 20 years, Joel refined this philosophy. He killed when necessary, and sometimes when merely convenient. He stole without remorse. He betrayed partners when the calculus favored survival. His reputation grew among Boston's smuggling community. Joel was competent, ruthless, and alive, which in this world made him exceptional. People feared him, and fear was more reliable than friendship. Tess became his partner in these shadows. Where Joel was brutal efficiency, Tess was cunning and charm when useful. cold calculation when not. She had lost her own family to the outbreak, though she spoke of it rarely. They were not friends in any meaningful sense. They were two people whose skills complemented each other, who trusted each other precisely as far as mutual benefit extended and not 1 inch further. In a world without trust, this clarity was its own form of honesty. They lived in an apartment in the edge of the Boston QZ, a space that was shelter and little else. No decoration, no comfort beyond the minimum required for sleep and function. Their wealth, such as it was, existed in hidden caches of contraband and the network of contacts who owed them favors or feared their retribution. They dealt with Robert, a small-time black market operator who supplied goods to those with ration cards to trade. They paid protection to local guards willing to look the other way. They navigated the complex ecosystem of illegal commerce with the skill of predators who understood their territory. Outside the quarantine zones, the world had transformed in ways both beautiful and terrible. Nature, released from human management, reclaimed what we had taken. Forests grew through highways, vines covered skyscrapers, deer wandered through shopping malls, birds nested in airports. The planet, it seemed, did not mourn humanity's fall. It simply continued, indifferent to our absence, following patterns older than our species. The earth was healing from us, though we did not like to think of it in those terms. But this wilderness was not empty. The infected remained, and they had evolved. In the first days, all infected were freshly turned, still driven by the fungus's basic command: spread. They ran, they attacked, they bit and clawed with desperate frenzy. But as time passed, as the fungus matured within its hosts, the infected progressed through stages, each more horrifying than the last. Runners were the newly infected, still recognizable as human. The fungus had not yet fully consumed their brain tissue. They retained crude intelligence, enough to open doors, to climb, to coordinate in basic ways. Their attack was savage but comprehensible. Human violence magnified by the removal of restraint and mercy. You could see in their eyes, sometimes, the fading traces of who they had been. Clickers were the next stage, infected for months or years. The fungus had erupted through their skulls, blooming in grotesque plates that destroyed their eyes and much of their facial structure. Blind, they navigated by echolocation, producing clicking sounds that echoed through dark spaces, painting the world in sound rather than sight. Their hearing was acute beyond human capacity. The slightest noise drew them: a footstep, a breath, the whisper of fabric against fabric. And once they detected prey, they attacked with speed and strength that seemed impossible for their decayed bodies. Their bite was instant infection. There was no recovery, only the choice between killing the bitten or watching them transform. Bloaters were the final stage, infected for years, perhaps decades. The fungus had fully consumed them, transforming their bodies into armored hulks. Thick fungal plates covered their skin, making them nearly impervious to bullets. Their strength was immense. They could tear a person apart with bare hands, or throw fungal projectiles that exploded in clouds of spores, infecting everyone nearby. They were rare, but where they appeared, death followed. Even experienced survivors fled, rather than fight them. And there were the spores. In enclosed spaces where infected had died and decayed, the fungus released clouds of reproductive particles. Breathe them in, and infection began immediately. Gas masks were survival equipment, not accessories. Entire buildings became death traps, filled with invisible infection waiting for the careless or desperate. Humanity fought this enemy every day. Patrol groups ventured outside the QZs to clear infected nests, to secure supply routes, to maintain the buffer zones that kept the hordes from overwhelming the walls. They burned infected bodies. They destroyed spore colonies. They mapped the movement patterns of clicker packs and bloater territories. It was endless work, a war without victory, only the hope of preventing defeat for one more day. But the infected were not the only danger beyond the walls. Other humans, those who had not made it to quarantine zones or had fled them, formed their own communities in the wilderness. Some were peaceful settlements, trying to farm and trade and rebuild something resembling civilization without Fedra's iron fist. But many were hunter clans, bandits who survived by preying on travelers, on patrol groups, on anyone weak enough to rob and kill. They set ambushes along roads. They created traps that maimed and captured. They were, in some ways, more dangerous than the infected, because they could plan, could deceive, could understand exactly how to break you. Joel and Tess had encountered hunters many times in their smuggling runs. They had killed when necessary. They had fled when outnumbered. They had learned the territories where certain clans operated and the routes that offered the best chance of avoiding conflict. But violence was always one miscalculation away, one piece of bad intelligence, one unlucky moment from erupting into a firefight where survival was chance more than skill. The daily calculus of the smuggling life was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Every deal required assessment. Is this person planning to betray me? Are these goods stolen in a way that will draw Fedra attention? Is this route compromised? Is that sound infected or human, or just the wind through broken buildings? Every decision cascaded into consequences, and wrong decisions ended in death or capture, which were often the same thing. Trust was the scarcest commodity. Joel trusted Tess because she had proven herself repeatedly, because they had saved each other's lives enough times that the debt was mutual and ongoing. But that trust extended only to competence and mutual benefit. He did not trust her with weakness. He did not share his nightmares of Sarah, the ones that came most nights, the memory of her weight growing slack in his arms, the blood that never quite washed away in dream. Logic. He did not tell her about the times he considered simply walking into infected territory and letting it end. Survival required hardness, and hardness required isolation, even from the person who knew you best. Tess had her own walls. Joel saw glimpses behind them sometimes, the way she looked at children in the QZ, the careful neutrality she maintained when faced with their existence, the way she drank, methodically, on certain nights, as if trying to drown something that kept surfacing, the scars on her arms that did not match any fight he knew about. They were partners, but they were not intimate in any way that mattered. They survived together because surviving alone was harder, and that was the full extent of their relationship. The underground economy they navigated was complex in its hierarchy and brutal in its enforcement. Above the small-time dealers like Robert were the serious operators, the ones who controlled territory and commanded loyalty through a combination of resources and violence. Joel and Tess occupied a middle tier, significant enough to have contacts and influence, careful enough to avoid drawing too much attention from either Fedra or the crime bosses who would view their success as competition. They dealt primarily in pills, antibiotics, pain medication, sleeping pills, anything pharmaceutical that Fedra rationed or did not provide at all. The QZ had medical facilities, but they served emergency cases only, and even then, only for citizens in good standing with sufficient ration cards to trade. A broken leg might get you a splint. A bullet wound might get you surgery if you could pay. Chronic pain, infection, psychological trauma, you were on your own unless you had access to the black market. Joel and Tess supplied that access. They smuggled pills in from outside the QZ, from abandoned pharmacies in the infected zones, from other smugglers who raided collapsed hospitals, from Fedra supply convoys when opportunity and desperation aligned. The profit margins were substantial. The risks were significant. People died in this business regularly, and their territories were absorbed by whoever could hold them. And so the years passed. 20 of them, each one harder than the last, each one confirming what Joel had learned on Outbreak Day. The world was cruel, survival was everything, and love was a weakness that got you killed. He became very good at surviving. He became very good at not feeling. He became, in many ways, exactly the kind of man that world required. But the world, indifferent to our plans, was about to introduce a variable that would shatter Joel's careful nihilism. A girl, immune to the infection that had destroyed civilization. A 14-year-old reminder of the daughter he had lost and the future he had stopped believing in. Her name was Ellie, and she would change everything. In the darkest times, rebellion takes many forms. Sometimes it is violence. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to accept. That darkness is permanent. The Fireflies were born from that refusal. In the chaos following the outbreak, as Fedra consolidated military control over the quarantine zones, some survivors rejected the bargain being offered: safety in exchange for submission, life in exchange for freedom. These dissidents formed a resistance movement, taking as their symbol a firefly, that small creature whose bioluminescence pierces the night, a light that cannot be extinguished by surrounding darkness. They called themselves freedom fighters. Fedra called them terrorists. The truth, as is often the case, contained elements of both. Marlene led the Fireflies with the conviction of someone who had watched the world end and refused to believe it could not be rebuilt better. She had been a teacher before the outbreak, someone who believed in potential, in growth, in the possibility of change. That idealism had not died with civilization. It had merely transformed, becoming harder, more willing to accept casualties in service of larger purpose. The Fireflies attacked Fedra checkpoints. They distributed propaganda. They rescued citizens marked for execution. They sought medical facilities and research equipment, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, a cure for the infection could be developed. It was a beautiful dream. It was also, by all evidence, impossible. 20 years of research in scattered laboratories had yielded nothing. The cordyceps infection was too integrated into the host's biology. By the time symptoms appeared, the fungus had already begun consuming brain tissue. The infected were not sick people who could be cured. They were corpses puppeted by a parasite that had learned to animate dead flesh. You could no more cure them than you could cure someone whose brain had been replaced by fungal growth. Death was mercy. Prevention was impossible. Immunity was a myth, until it was not. Ellie was 14 years old when Joel met her. 14 years old, which meant she had been born after the outbreak, had never known the world before, had grown up in a quarantine zone where hunger and violence and fear were simply the conditions of existence. She was thin, as most children were, rations being what they were. She was sharp-tongued, as children raised without softness often became. She was fiercely independent, having learned early that adults could not be counted on, that survival meant relying on yourself first, and others only when absolutely necessary. She was also immune to cordyceps infection, the only immune human anyone had ever documented. 3 weeks before Joel met her, Ellie had been bitten by an infected runner. She had been with her best friend Riley in a section of the Boston QZ that was off-limits, abandoned after an outbreak years prior. They were doing what teenagers do, exploring, pushing boundaries, stealing moments of freedom in a world that offered none. The runner attacked from the shadows. Both girls were bitten, Riley on the forearm, Ellie on the hand. They sat together in that abandoned building, waiting for the infection to take hold, waiting for the fever, the confusion, the transformation into something no longer human. Riley turned within hours. The fungus spread through her bloodstream, crossed her blood-brain barrier, began its terrible work of consumption and reprogramming. Ellie had to watch as her best friend's eyes went vacant, as her jaw distended, as she lunged with the single-minded purpose of spreading infection. Ellie ran. She hid. She waited for her own transformation. But it never came. The bite mark on her hand healed. Not cleanly, it left a scar, a circular reminder of the impossible thing that had happened, but it healed as a normal wound would. No fever, no fungal growth, no loss of self. The infection that killed everyone it touched had touched her and failed. She was immune. The Fireflies had been searching for someone like Ellie since the outbreak began. An immune individual might hold the key to a vaccine, to understanding how the human immune system could be weaponized against the fungus, to saving what remained of humanity. When Marlene discovered Ellie's immunity, she saw not a child but a strategic asset, a chance at redemption for a species that seemed doomed to extinction. But Ellie was in Boston, and the Fireflies' best medical facility was across the country in Salt Lake City, where researchers still maintained working laboratories and equipment. Ellie needed to be transported. The route was thousands of miles through infected zones and hunter territories. Fedra would shoot her on sight if they discovered her immunity too dangerous to let such a strategic asset fall into rebel hands. It required smugglers, people who knew how to move unseen, who had the skills and ruthlessness to protect cargo at any cost. It required Joel and Tess. The deal came through Robert, the small-time dealer who owed them for a weapons shipment that had gone sideways. Marlene approached Joel and Tess with a simple proposition: transport a girl to the edge of the city, hand her off to another Firefly group who would continue the journey west. In exchange, a cache of weapons and supplies that would set them up for months. Simple escort mission. A few hours of work for substantial reward. Joel's first instinct was refusal. He did not work with the Fireflies. Their ideology was dangerous, their enemies numerous, their life expectancy short. Association with them drew Fedra attention, and attention was death. But Tess saw the opportunity. The weapons cache Marlene offered was significant. They could trade it, expand their operation, secure their position in the smuggling hierarchy, and the girl was just cargo. You did not have to believe in the Fireflies' cause to take their payment. Joel agreed, but he did not like it. He did not like the way Marlene looked at him, as if she knew something about him, about his capacity for violence, about the usefulness of a man who had spent 20 years becoming ruthless. He did not like that the cargo was a child, because children reminded him of things he worked very hard to forget. He did not like the secrecy, the way Marlene insisted they not ask questions, not know details, just move the package and collect payment. But survival required pragmatism, so he agreed. Meeting Ellie confirmed his misgivings. She was mouthy, defensive, clearly frightened despite her attempts to hide it. She looked at Joel and Tess with the suspicion children in this world learned early. Adults were dangerous. Adults had agendas. Adults would sacrifice you if it served their purpose. She was not wrong. Joel's intention was exactly that: clinical move her from point A to point B, collect payment, never think about her again. They moved through Boston's QZ under cover of darkness, avoiding Fedra patrols, using routes through abandoned buildings that Joel and Tess had developed over years of. Smuggling. Ellie followed without complaint, keeping pace, asking questions Joel refused to answer. She had a backpack with her, worn and patched, containing whatever possessions a child in the apocalypse considered essential. Joel did not ask what. Cargo did not require personal connection. The plan was to use the old subway tunnels to exit the QZ unseen, connecting to the ruins of the Capitol building where the Firefly handoff would occur. The tunnels were dangerous, infected used them as nesting grounds, and the darkness made every corner a potential ambush, but they were safer than trying to bypass Fedra's perimeter checkpoints. Joel and Tess had made this run before. They knew the routes, the timing, the sounds that meant danger. But this time, something was different. This time, Fedra was conducting sweeps in the tunnels, expanded patrols looking for firefly activity. This time, the infection density was higher than expected. Clickers in places that should have been clear. This time, the routine operation became a running battle through darkness, lit only by flashlights. Every corner a decision between stealth and speed. Every encounter a choice between hiding and fighting. Ellie proved she could handle herself. She stayed quiet when silence was survival. She moved quickly when Joel signaled. She did not freeze when a clicker passed within feet of their hiding spot, its clicking echoing off tunnel walls, its blind face turning towards sounds only it could hear. She had grown up in this world. She understood the rules. But Joel saw something else in those hours underground. He saw how she looked at the infected, not with the numbed acceptance most survivors showed, but with a kind of focused attention, as if studying them, as if trying to understand something. He saw how she tensed when they passed fresh corpses, recently killed, not by infected but by humans, bodies stripped of supplies and left to rot. He saw in her the same thing he had seen in Sarah, awareness, intelligence, the kind of consciousness that made this world harder to bear because you understood exactly how terrible it was. He tried not to see it. Cargo was cargo. Connection was weakness. They reached the Capitol building as dawn broke over Boston. The building had been a seat of government once, a place where laws were debated and futures decided. Now it was a hollowed ruin, its dome collapsed, its chambers open to the sky, nature growing through marble floors. The Fireflies used it as a rally point, a symbol of old authority reclaimed for new purpose. But something was wrong. The building was too quiet. No sentries, no signals, just silence and the sound of wind through broken stone. Tess and Joel moved cautiously through the ruins, weapons drawn, Ellie between them. They found the Fireflies in what had once been the main chamber. 7 bodies. 8. Some shot, some clearly killed by infected. Blood splattered across walls covered in firefly graffiti, messages of hope and rebellion, now epitaphs. The handoff was compromised. The plan was failed. They were alone with a girl they could not deliver and a payment they would not receive. Tess checked the bodies, looking for clues, for supplies, for anything useful. Joel watched the entrances, listening for infected drawn by the scent of fresh blood. Ellie stood in the center of the carnage, looking at the bodies with an expression Joel could not quite read. Not horror, she had seen death before. Something else. Something like grief for strangers, for a mission failed before she could understand what it meant. Then Tess made a sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, just a small, quiet sound that made Joel turn. She was standing very still. Her hand was on her neck, and when she pulled it away, Joel saw the bite mark. In the tunnels, in the chaos of the escape, an infected had gotten close enough. Just for a moment, just long enough. The calculation every survivor lived with had finally caught. Tess. The infection was in her bloodstream. The countdown had begun. Joel felt something he had not felt in 20 years. The cold void of loss opening beneath him. The understanding that someone he had survived with, relied on, existed alongside for 2 decades, was about to stop existing. Tess was bitten. Tess would turn. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing that could be done about it. Ellie backed away slowly. Joel raised his gun, not quite pointing it, but not quite not pointing it either. Tess looked at them both. And in her eyes was the calculation Joel had seen many times in others, never expecting to see in her. Acceptance. How long? Joel asked. Hour, maybe 2, Tess said. Her voice was steady. 20 years of surviving had taught her how to face death with pragmatism. We could, Joel started, but Tess cut him off. No, we couldn't. She looked at Ellie. Show him. Ellie hesitated, then pulled up her sleeve. The bite mark on her hand was visible. Weeks old, healed, impossible. She's immune, Tess said. The fireflies weren't lying. She's real. The cure is real. Joel looked at the bite on Ellie's hand, at the scar tissue where fungal growth should have erupted, at the evidence of something that should not exist. His mind, trained by 20 years to accept only what served survival, rejected it. Immunity was myth. This was trick, infection presenting differently, death delayed but not prevented. No one's immune, Joel said. She is. Tess grabbed his arm, and Joel felt how her hand was already too warm. Fever beginning its work. Joel, this matters. She matters. The fireflies in Salt Lake can use her to make a cure. A real cure. A vaccine. The end of all this? Joel pulled away. I don't believe in the fireflies' bullshit any more than I believe in that girl's immunity. We're done. We go back to Boston. We find another deal. We survive. No. Tess's voice was sharp. You survive. You get her to Tommy. He still talks to the fireflies. He can get her to Salt Lake. You owe me this. I don't owe you suicide. You owe me 20 years. Tess looked at him, and Joel saw the weight of those years in her face. Every compromise and violence and loss they had accumulated together. 20 years of watching you just exist, just survive, never live, never hope, just breathing and killing and surviving for no goddamn reason except you're too stubborn to die. Well, here's a reason. Her. The sound of clickers echoed through the Capitol building. The infected, drawn by their voices, by the scent of blood. Dozens of them, maybe more. Converging on their position, Tess pulled out a can of gasoline from her pack. Then another, then her lighter. Joel understood what she was planning. Stay behind, draw the infected, create an explosion that would give Joel and Ellie time to escape, sacrifice herself not just to survive a few more hours in agony, but to make her death mean something. Go, she said. Take her. Do this one good thing. For once in 20 years, Joel, do something that matters. Joel looked at Tess, at this woman who had survived alongside him, who had never asked for softness, who was asking now only that her death serve a purpose. He looked at Ellie, this impossible girl with her impossible immunity, this cargo that had become something else, something that Tess believed was worth dying for. The clickers were close, seconds away. Joel, Tess said, go, and he went. He grabbed Ellie's arm and ran, pulling her through the Capitol building's ruins, through corridors and chambers, toward the exit that would lead them into the wider ruins of Boston. Behind them, he heard gunfire. Tess, buying time. Tess, making the infected converge on her position. Tess, in her final moments, believing in something beyond survival. Then, the explosion. Fire roaring through the Capitol building, consuming infected and firefly corpses, and 20 years of Joel's history with a woman who had never asked him to be anything but what he was, until the very end, when she had asked him to be better. They made it outside. The morning sun was bright, painful after the tunnel's darkness. Ellie was breathing hard, confused, frightened. Joel's hand was still on her arm, though he did not remember maintaining the grip. Behind them, smoke rose from the Capitol building, thick and black, a funeral pyre visible across the city. Joel stood in the ruins, holding the arm of a girl he did not want to protect, committed by a dead woman's last request to a mission he did not believe in. facing a journey across a continent filled with infected and hunters and every imaginable death, all to deliver cargo he was convinced was worthless to people he was certain would fail. Tess had asked him to do one good thing, one thing that mattered. Joel looked at Ellie, this child staring up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance and something else, hope, maybe, or the desire for hope, for belief that her existence meant something beyond just surviving another day. "We're going to my brother," Joel said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Wyoming. He knows the Fireflies. He can take you to Salt Lake. That's it. That's all I'm doing." "Okay," Ellie said quietly. "You do what I say when I say it. No questions, no arguments. You slow me down, I leave you. You understand?" "Yeah." Joel looked west, toward the thousands of miles between Boston and Wyoming, between this moment and delivering on Tess's final request. He thought about turning around, about going back to the QZ, about forgetting this impossible girl and her impossible immunity and continuing the existence that had sustained him for 20 years. But Tess had been right about one thing. He owed her. 20 years of partnership, of survival, of existing alongside someone in a world that destroyed everyone eventually. He owed her this last thing, even if he thought it was pointless, even if he believed the Firefly's dream was delusion, even if bringing this girl west would probably get them both killed. He owed Tess the attempt. "Let's go," Joel said, and began walking west, Ellie following, the smoke from Tess's pyre rising behind them. The journey begun not from hope but from debt, not from belief but from obligation. It would have to be enough. The distance between Boston and Wyoming is approximately 1,800 miles. Before the outbreak, this was a journey of days, accomplished in climate-controlled comfort on interstate highways, maintained by governments that no longer existed. After the outbreak, it became a months-long ordeal through territory reclaimed by nature and infected, where every mile might be your last, where the map was suggestion rather than certainty, and where the greatest danger was often not the infected but other survivors, who had learned the same lessons about ruthlessness that Joel had spent 20 years mastering. They travelled on foot mostly, sometimes finding working vehicles with enough fuel for a few miles, sometimes trading for rides with caravans brave or foolish enough to traverse infected zones. Joel moved with the caution of someone who had survived by assuming every shadow held threat, every sound meant danger. Ellie followed, learning his patterns, understanding when silence was required and when questions might be tolerated. The first weeks were teaching moments, though Joel would not have called them that. He taught by example how to move quietly through areas where infected nested, how to distinguish clicker sounds from wind through ruins, how to make fire without smoke, how to purify water, how to know when fighting was necessary and when survival meant running. Ellie absorbed these lessons with the quick intelligence of someone who understood that attention meant survival. But she also asked questions, constant questions, about the world before, about Joel's life, about why he did things certain ways, about whether he believed the cure was possible. Joel answered minimally or not at all, maintaining the emotional distance that had kept him alive. She was cargo, temporary responsibility. He would deliver her to Tommy, and then she would be someone else's problem, someone else's impossible hope. Yet gradually, despite his intentions, patterns emerged. Ellie proved useful. She could fit through spaces Joel could not, climb to vantage points, serve as lookout while he cleared buildings. She made observations he had not taught her, showing an instinct for survival that went beyond instruction. And occasionally, very occasionally, she would say something that reminded him she was 14, a child in circumstances that destroyed childhood, and something in him would react before he could stop it, some protective instinct he thought he had buried with Sarah. He hated that reaction, hated the weakness it represented, hated that this girl was becoming something more than cargo despite his efforts to keep her at cargo distance. They traveled through Massachusetts, then into New York, avoiding the ruins of major cities where infected populations numbered in the thousands, navigating through smaller towns where nature had begun the work of erasing human construction. Trees grew through roofs. Vines covered cars. Animals had returned: deer, elk, even wolves in some regions. Predators reclaiming their ecological role now that humans no longer dominated. The world was healing, if healing meant returning to patterns that preceded humanity's agricultural revolution. It was beautiful in ways Joel had trained himself not to notice. Survival required focus on threat, not aesthetic appreciation. But Ellie noticed. She would stop to look at a sunset through broken windows, at how light filtered through overgrown buildings, at the way nature transformed human artifacts into something else. She carried a joke book, worn and childish, reading jokes aloud despite Joel's lack of response. She hummed sometimes while walking. She was, despite everything, still capable of wonder. Joel found this both incomprehensible and oddly compelling. He had forgotten that such capacity existed, had trained himself out of wonder as unnecessary luxury. But Ellie had been born into hell and somehow retained the ability to find beauty in ruins, humor in darkness, hope in a journey toward people who claimed they could cure the incurable. In western Massachusetts, they encountered Bill's compound. Bill was a survivalist who'd been preparing for civilization's end long before it arrived. When the outbreak came, he already had supplies, weapons, defensive fortifications, and most importantly, the mindset required to survive alone. His town was a fortress of one man's paranoia proven right. Fences electrified by generators, traps throughout the streets, enough ammunition and food to last years. He trusted no one, helped no one, and had survived a decade longer than most by maintaining that isolation. But even Bill had not been entirely alone. Frank had arrived years earlier, injured, desperate, fleeing hunters who had killed his group. Bill found him caught in one of the perimeter traps, wounded, likely to die without help. Bill should have left him, should have shot him to prevent him from attracting infected with his cries, should have done exactly what Joel would have done, calculated that one stranger's life was not worth compromising security. But Bill did not. He brought Frank inside, treated his wounds, let him stay temporarily, then less temporarily, then not temporarily at all. Over years, in a fortress designed for solitary survival, two men built something that resembled a life together. They planted gardens, they played piano, they shared meals and beds and the small domesticities that make existence bearable. They built, against all logic and survival instinct, love in the apocalypse. Frank's death had been recent when Joel and Ellie arrived. Not infected, not violence, sickness, the kind that medicine might have cured in the world before, but which in this world meant only slow deterioration and inevitable end. Bill had nursed him through the final months, watching the person who had given his paranoid existence meaning fade day by day, unable to stop it, unable to do anything but be present for the suffering. The letter Bill left explained it all. He had written it knowing Joel might come, knowing he owed Joel for past favors, wanting to explain why the compound was empty, why no one would answer. Frank had died. Bill had chosen to follow shortly after. Pills, taken together in the bedroom they had shared, lying side by side as consciousness faded. A choice made not from despair but from completion. Frank had been Bill's world. Without him, survival had no purpose. So Bill chose to end on his own terms, with Frank, rather than continuing alone in a fortress that was now just a cage. Joel read the letter in Bill's living room, surrounded by evidence of a life lived. Photos on walls, music on shelves, dishes in the sink, mundane artifacts of domestic existence. He did not read it aloud, did not explain to Ellie what it contained, just folded it carefully and put it in his pack, his face expressionless. But Ellie saw the room, saw the piano where Bill and Frank had played together, saw the garden they had tended, saw proof that even in this world, even in isolation, two people had found each other and built something worth living for, something so meaningful that when it ended, continuing alone seemed pointless. She did not say anything about it, did not need to. The evidence spoke its own truth. Love persisted. Connection mattered. Some things were worth the vulnerability they required. Joel took what supplies were useful ammunition, a working truck with fuel, food preserved in Bill's substantial stores. Then they drove away from the compound, leaving behind two men who had proven that survival without meaning was just extended death. That choosing when and how to die could be its own form of agency. The truck carried them through Pennsylvania, then into Ohio, making better time than weeks of walking. But fuel was finite. An infected could hear engines from miles away, and eventually the tank ran dry in the outskirts of Pittsburgh. They continued on foot, moving through a city that had become a war zone between rival survivor factions, each controlling territory, each defending it with the ruthlessness required to hold anything in this world. In Pittsburgh, they met Henry and Sam. Brothers, like Joel and Tommy, had been brothers. Henry was older, protective, trying to keep his younger brother safe in circumstances that destroyed safety. Sam was 8 years old, deaf, communicating through sign language and expressions, dependent on Henry for translation and protection. They had been with a larger group, but hunters had attacked, killed most, scattered the rest. Now they were alone, trying to reach a settlement they had heard, about where communities still functioned, where children could grow up with some semblance of normalcy. They joined forces with Joel and Ellie because numbers increased survival odds. 4 people could maintain watch rotations, cover more angles, provide backup when one was injured or exhausted. It was strategic alliance, not friendship. Joel made that clear. They would travel together through Pittsburgh's dangerous territory, then separate when routes diverged. Temporary partnership of convenience. But Ellie and Sam became friends almost immediately. They taught each other signs. They drew pictures together in the evenings when Joel and Henry deemed their location secure enough for light. They played the kind of games children invented from nothing, finding interesting objects in ruins, making up stories about what buildings had been, competing to spot infected first. Sam could not hear infected approach, but Ellie watched for him, warned him, became his ears when danger threatened. Joel watched this happening and said nothing. Henry watched it too, and in quiet moments around their fire, he and Joel spoke with the careful honesty of men who understood what they were trying to protect and how likely they were to fail. "You think there's really a cure?" Henry asked one night while Ellie and Sam slept. "No," Joel said, "but you're taking her anyway." "I'm taking her to my brother. He can take her to the Fireflies. What they do with her after that isn't my concern." Henry looked at where Ellie slept, wrapped in a jacket too large for her, using her backpack as pillow. "She matters to you. She's cargo. Cargo doesn't make you check she's eating enough. Cargo doesn't make you slow down when she's tired even though you're trying to hide it." Joel said nothing. Henry was right, and both men knew it, but acknowledging it gave it power, made it real, and Joel had spent 20 years refusing to let anything matter beyond immediate survival. They moved through Pittsburgh together. 4 people navigating a city divided into hunter territories. They used the sewers, dark and flooded, infected nesting in the depths. They surfaced in abandoned suburbs where nature had begun reclaiming yards and gardens. They avoided main roads where hunters set ambushes. They survived through constant vigilance and occasional violence when avoidance failed. Sam was bitten in the sewers. It happened quickly. A runner, emerging from dark water, grabbing his leg before anyone could react. Henry shot it immediately, killed it before it could bite down hard, pulled Sam away. The wound was small, just a scratch really, barely broke skin. Maybe it would be fine. Maybe the infection required deeper wound. Maybe. They did not say what they all knew. Any bite meant infection. The depth affected only the speed. Sam had hours, maybe a day. Then the fever would come. Then the transformation. Then he would cease being Sam and become infected, become threat, become something that would have to be killed. They made camp in a house with good sightlines, defensible doors, escape routes planned. They started a small fire. They pretended it was normal evening, normal rest, normal tomorrow waiting after sleep. Sam drew pictures, showing them to Ellie, his hands moving in signs she mostly understood. Henry held his brother close, memorizing him, trying to compress a lifetime of protection into final hours. Ellie showed Sam her bite, the healed scar, the impossible immunity. She told him in signs and words that she had been bitten and survived, that maybe he would too, that hope was possible. She meant it kindly, she meant it as comfort. She did not understand yet that hope, in circumstances without hope, was cruelty. They slept in shifts. Henry held Sam. Joel kept watch, rifle ready, looking out at Pittsburgh's ruins, at the city that would be Sam's tomb. He knew what would happen, had seen it countless times, the fever, the confusion, the moment when the person you knew stopped existing and infection took their place. He knew Henry would wait until the last possible moment to accept it, knew that when acceptance came, it would destroy him. Dawn arrived with terrible certainty. Sam's fever had begun in the night. Henry had felt it, known it, but held his brother anyway, unable to do what needed doing. By morning, Sam was confused, disoriented, the fungus beginning its work. His eyes, which had been bright with intelligence and humor, began to glaze. His movements became erratic. The transformation was starting. Ellie woke to find Sam leaning over her, his jaw distending, the infected's instinct overriding what remained of the boy. She screamed. Joel moved, but Henry was faster, pulling Sam away, wrestling his transforming brother to the ground. Sam fought with infected strength, no longer recognizing his brother, no longer capable of recognition. The fungus had consumed identity, left only the imperative to spread. Henry held Sam, down, crying, apologizing, telling his brother he loved him, that he was sorry, that he had failed in the one job that mattered, keeping Sam safe. Then he pulled out his pistol, put it to Sam's head. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small room. Silence followed, not external, infected in the distance, whined through broken windows, mourning birds, but internal, the silence that follows when something fundamental breaks. Henry held his brother's body, 8 years old, dead not from the infected that had bitten him, but from the brother who had loved him enough to end it before the transformation completed. Joel and Ellie stood frozen, watching grief too large for intervention. Then Henry stood, looked at them both with eyes that had lost everything, raised his pistol again. Joel understood a second before it happened, tried to move, to intervene, but was too slow, too late. The second gunshot echoed the first. Henry fell beside Sam, brother with brother, both dead in the ruins of Pittsburgh, another casualty not of infection but of love, of the weight of protecting someone in a world designed to destroy protection, of trying to be good in circumstances that punished goodness. Joel and Ellie left them there. Buried them would have been kind, but survival demanded movement, and hunters would have heard the gunshots. They walked away from two brothers who had briefly made their journey feel less lonely, who had proven that temporary connection could still end in permanent loss, who had demonstrated again what Joel had known for 20 years. Caring about anyone was liability that eventually killed you. Ellie was silent for days after Pittsburgh. She had known death, had seen it constantly, had even caused it herself when necessary, but Sam's death was different. Sam had been her friend. Sam had been a child like her. Sam had proven that immunity was unique to her alone, that the bite that had healed on her hand was not something she could share or transfer, that her survival came at the cost of watching others die from the same infection she was immune to. Joel saw her withdraw, saw the light that had persisted despite everything dim slightly, saw her understand something he had learned 20 years ago. In this world, everyone you care about will die, and you will be forced to witness it, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. They traveled on through Ohio, then Indiana, then Illinois. The miles accumulated, the seasons changed. Fall arrived, then winter, making travel harder but infected slower, cold affecting their fungal biology in ways that gave survivors slight advantage. They found shelter in abandoned houses, in cars, in caves where nothing else offered protection. They shared food that was never enough, warmth from fires that never quite defeated the cold, silence that had become their primary mode of communication. But gradually, despite Pittsburgh's lessons, despite the weight of loss, something shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, not family, but partnership. The kind built not from choice, but from surviving together, from watching each other's backs through dozens of close calls, from the accumulated trust of someone who could kill you in your sleep but consistently chooses not to. Ellie started reading her joke book aloud again. Joel, very occasionally, almost smiled at the particularly bad puns. She taught him some of the signs Sam had taught her. He showed her how to clean weapons, how to make ammunition last, how to track by reading subtle signs in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. They developed rhythms, patterns, the unspoken language of people who operate as unit rather than individuals. Joel tried to resist it, tried to maintain the distance that protected against loss. But Ellie was relentless in her small ways, chipping at the walls he had built, not with demands for connection, but simply by being present, by existing alongside him, by proving day after day that she could keep up, could contribute, could be relied upon. Winter deepened as they approached Wyoming. The infected were slower in cold, hibernating in warmer buildings, their fungal biology less active at low temperatures. But the cold itself was enemy, requiring constant fire, constant movement to prevent hypothermia, constant vigilance against frostbite. They wrapped themselves in every layer they could find, moved through snow that made quiet travel impossible, left tracks that anything could follow. Tommy's settlement was called Jackson. Joel's brother had written to him years ago, back when communication between QZs was still possible through courier networks. Tommy had left Boston, left Joel, joined the Fireflies because he still believed in causes, in fighting for something beyond survival. Then he had left the Fireflies too, tired of their tactics, their willingness to sacrifice civilians for strategic goals. He had found Jackson, a community that functioned without Fedra, without military dictatorship, just people trying to rebuild something resembling normal life. Joel had not responded to Tommy's letters, had not visited despite knowing the location. Brothers were liability, family was weakness, connection was the thing that got you killed. But now he had cargo to deliver, a promise to test to fulfill, and Tommy was his exit from responsibility for Ellie and her impossible immunity. They reached Jackson in late winter, arriving at gates that were actually maintained, walls that were actually defended by people who did not immediately point guns. The settlement was remarkable. Functional infrastructure, electricity from a hydroelectric dam, greenhouses for food, livestock, houses where people lived rather than just survived. It was proof that civilization could persist without military dictatorship, that cooperation could still function, that humanity had not entirely lost the capacity for building rather than destroying. Tommy met them at the gates, older, weathered, but with something in his eyes that Joel had lost decades ago, belief that tomorrow might be better than today. Brothers embraced with the awkwardness of men who had not spoken in years, who had chosen different paths and did not entirely understand each other's choices. Joel explained Ellie, her immunity, the Firefly's mission, his promise to Tess. He explained it clinically, cargo being transferred, responsibility being reassigned. He was done. He had fulfilled his obligation. Tommy knew the Fireflies could get Ellie to Salt Lake City. Joel's part was finished. Tommy agreed. Of course he did. The cure was humanity's hope. Ellie was precious beyond measure. He would take her west, protect her, ensure she reached the Fireflies safely. Joel could stay in Jackson, rest, maybe even settle. He had earned it. 20+ years of surviving entitled him to stop, to exist somewhere safe, to retire from the endless violence and vigilance. It was exactly what Joel wanted, exactly what he had planned since leaving Boston. But Ellie heard him arranging her transfer, heard him talking about her as cargo, as responsibility to be handed off, as burden he was eager to shed. Heard him planning to stay in Jackson while she continued west with strangers. Heard him choosing safety over completing the journey they had started together. She found him in Jackson's dining hall, her face hard, her voice controlled fury. "I'm not your cargo," she said. "You don't get to just drop me off." "I'm delivering you to the Fireflies like I promised Tess," Joel replied. "Tommy can take you the rest of the way." "I don't know Tommy. I know you. You've known me for a few months. That doesn't mean anything. It means you keep me alive. It means I trust you. It means—" She stopped, struggling with emotions she had learned to suppress, because emotions were liability. "Everyone I care about either dies or leaves me. Everyone except you. And now you're doing it, too. I'm not your father. I'm not your friend. I got you here. That's all I agreed to. Then why did you teach me to shoot? Why did you check if I was eating? Why did you—" Her voice broke slightly. "Why did you act like you cared if you were just going to leave?" Joel looked at this girl who reminded him of Sarah, who had somehow, despite his best efforts, become something more than cargo, who was asking him to care, to connect, to risk the pain that came with losing people you let matter. "I'm not traveling with you because I care," he said, voice flat. "I'm doing it because I owed Tess. That debt's paid. We're done." Ellie looked at him with something between betrayal and understanding. She had grown up in this world. She understood that survival meant putting yourself first. But she had also believed, foolishly perhaps, that Joel was different, that the months together had meant something, that she was something more than burden to be transferred. "Fine," she said. "Stay here. Hide in your safe little town. I'll go west with Tommy." She left. Joel sat in the empty hall, having gotten exactly what he wanted: freedom from responsibility, release from the growing connection he had tried to prevent, the ability to stop moving, to rest, to survive in comfort rather than constant threat. It should have felt like relief. It felt like losing Sarah again. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones we do not consciously choose. They choose us, rising from depths we did not know existed, overriding logic and survival instinct with something older, something that existed before rationality taught us to protect ourselves from pain. Joel left Jackson with Ellie the next morning. He told himself it was practical calculation. Tommy had a pregnant wife, responsibilities to Jackson, people depending on him. Joel was expendable, experienced in cross-country travel, better suited to protecting cargo through infected zones and hunter territories. He told himself it was fulfilling the promise to Tess completely rather than partially, seeing the mission through rather than trusting others to finish what he had started. He did not acknowledge, even to himself, that Ellie's accusation had struck something he thought he had buried with Sarah, that the thought of her travelling west with strangers, of not being there if she needed him, of not knowing if she made it safely, was unbearable. That somewhere in the months of survival together, she had stopped being cargo and become something he could not name but also could not abandon. Ellie said nothing when he told her he was coming. Barriers that had not fully degraded. Equipment moved recently, traces suggesting people had been here within weeks, not years. Joel and Ellie moved carefully through the campus, searching for fireflies, for evidence of research, for direction on what to do next. They found the research building, found laboratories that had been operational, equipment that had been maintained, notes suggesting real work toward understanding cordyceps biology. But they also found abandonment. The fireflies had left, recently and in apparent hurry. Equipment remained, but people did not. Whatever research had been conducted here had been packed up and moved, or simply ceased when resources ran out or infection breached defenses. Joel was searching the laboratories when Ellie called out that she had found something. He turned toward her voice, distracted, attention divided between immediate surroundings and the evidence of firefly failure scattered across benches and desks. The ambush came from multiple directions simultaneously. Bandits, not infected, hunters who had established territory in the university, who used it as base for raiding parties, who saw two travelers, one old man, one girl, one horse with supplies as opportunity too valuable to pass. They had tracked Joel and Ellie through campus, waited for optimal moment, struck with coordination that spoke to experience and practice. Joel reacted with 20 years of survival instinct, pulling weapon, finding cover, returning fire. But there were too many, attacking from too many angles, and he was trying to protect Ellie while defending himself. Divided attention, creating vulnerability. He moved toward her, trying to put himself between her and the attackers, trying to do what he had failed to do for Sarah. He did not see the raider with the makeshift spear until it punched through his abdomen. The pain was immediate and total, white-hot agony radiating from the wound. Joel looked down, saw the wooden shaft protruding from his stomach, saw blood spreading across his jacket. He had seen this wound before, in others, knew what it meant. Perforated intestine, internal bleeding, infection inevitable without antibiotics and surgery. Days to live, maybe a week if lucky. Death sentence delivered by sharpened wood. Ellie appeared beside him, firing the pistol he had taught her to use, dropping one raider, then another. She was screaming, fury and fear combined. A child trying to protect someone she should not have to protect. Joel tried to tell her to run, to leave him, to survive, but words would not form through the pain. His legs gave out. The world tilted, darkened at the edges. The raiders closed in. Ellie stood over Joel, still firing, but she was 14 years old, with limited ammunition against experienced killers. It should have ended there, in a university laboratory, Joel bleeding out while Ellie died trying to defend him. Then the horse, panicked by gunfire, bolted into the raiders, scattering them, creating chaos. Ellie grabbed Joel under the arms, dragged him with strength that should not have existed in her small frame, pulled him toward an exit while raiders regrouped. She got him outside, onto the horse, fled into the forest beyond campus before pursuit could organize. Joel's consciousness came and went. He was aware of movement, of Ellie leading, the horse, of being tied to the saddle to prevent falling, of pain that was constant and overwhelming. He tried to tell her to leave him, tried to explain that the wound was mortal, that survival required abandoning dead weight. But she would not listen, or could not hear, or refused to accept what she certainly understood. She found shelter in a subdivision outside the university, houses that had been abandoned 20 years ago and never reoccupied. Carried him inside a garage, barricaded the door, checked the wound with hands that shook but remained steady enough to work. The spear had gone through, which was better than still being inside, but the damage was severe. Joel was losing blood, going into shock, infection beginning its work. Ellie had limited supplies, bandages, some antibiotics from Jackson, needle and thread. For suturing she did not know how to do. She tried anyway, working by flashlight, crying while she worked, talking to Joel to keep him conscious, to keep him with her. "You don't get to die," she said while stitching flesh that should have been sewn by trained hands in sterile conditions. "You don't get to leave me alone. You promised to take me to the Fireflies. You don't break promises." Joel tried to respond, but fever was setting in, infection spreading through his bloodstream despite the antibiotics, despite Ellie's desperate care. His consciousness faded, returned, faded again. He was dimly aware of Ellie checking his wound, changing bandages, trying to get him to drink water. Aware of her voice reading from her joke book, reciting bad puns she knew he hated, as if the familiarity of annoyance could call him back from the edge. Days passed, maybe a week. Time became fluid, pain the only constant. Joel's fever burned, delirious dreams mixing with waking hallucinations. He saw Sarah, 12 years old, asking why he had not protected her. Saw Tess, telling him he owed her one good thing. Saw Tommy, asking if surviving was the same as living. Saw Ellie, asking if she was cargo or something more. He woke to find Ellie gone. The garage was cold. Outside, snow was falling, late winter storm, unusual for the season but not impossible. Joel tried to sit up, agony shooting through his torso, but managed to brace himself against the wall. The wound was bandaged, infected, but not yet lethal. He should be dead, should have died days ago. That he was alive meant Ellie had kept him alive, had somehow found enough supplies and knowledge to prevent infection from killing him immediately. But where was she? He found her note, written on a torn page from her joke book. "Went to find medicine. Stay alive until I get back." That's an order. Joel tried to stand, to go after her, to protect her from whatever threats existed in a world designed to kill children. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out, before the wound reopened, before he understood with terrible clarity that he was helpless, that Ellie was alone, that the roles had reversed, and she was now the protector while he was the burden. It was the most terrifying realization of his life. Ellie had tracked the bandits who had ambushed them, had followed their trail back to their settlement, a small community established in a town some miles from the university. She had gone there looking for antibiotics, for medical supplies, for anything that could save Joel. She had gone alone, 14 years old, into territory controlled by people who had tried to kill them. She had not come back. The settlement Ellie had found was run by a man named David. He was older, charismatic, the kind of person who spoke with authority and kindness that seemed genuine until you looked closely at what he was actually saying. He led a community of survivors who had banded together for mutual protection, who shared resources and labor, who followed his guidance with the devotion of people who needed someone to believe in. They were also cannibals. In a world where food was scarce, where hunting was dangerous and farming difficult, where resources dwindled and winters were harsh, David's community had made a calculation. Humans were meat, survivors who died, raiders who attacked, travelers who wandered too close they could be consumed. It was practical. It was efficient. It violated every taboo civilization had established, but civilization was dead, and survival was what remained. David found Ellie when she was trying to steal medicine from their supplies. She had been careful, quiet, but not careful enough. He could have killed her immediately. His people wanted to the bandits she had killed at the university, had been their scouts. But David saw something else in her, saw youth, resilience, intelligence, saw a potential convert to his way of thinking, or perhaps something darker, something he dressed in religious language about salvation and purpose, but which was really about power and possession. He kept her alive, talked to her about survival, about the necessity of hard choices, about how morality was luxury the apocalypse did not permit. He fed her, though she did not know what she was eating until later. He treated her with gentleness that made his intentions more sinister, not less. Ellie pretended compliance while searching for escape. She was good at pretending had survived in the Boston QZ by learning to show people what they wanted to see while hiding what she actually thought. She laughed at David's jokes. She listened to his sermons. She acted like a child, grateful for protection, all while watching patterns, noting weaknesses, planning violence. David's mistake was the same mistake people had been making about children since the outbreak, assuming youth meant helplessness. Ellie had been surviving in the apocalypse since birth. She had killed infected and humans. She had watched friends die. She had dragged a wounded man through hostile territory and kept him alive through medical care she had improvised from. Incomplete knowledge. She was 14 years old and more dangerous than David understood. She learned about the cannibalism by accident, overhearing conversation between David and his lieutenant about the meat they had processed, about the need to hunt for more supplies when their current stock ran low. She understood then what the community was, what David was, what she had been eating during her captivity. The horror was immediate and visceral, but she swallowed it, maintained her act, waited for opportunity. The opportunity came when David moved her to the town's old restaurant, a building they used for butchering. He intended to keep her there, isolated, under his control. He spoke about her joining the community, about her potential, about how she could be important to their survival. His words were religious, but his intent was predatory. The particular predation that powerful men directed at powerless girls, dressed in whatever language made it seem righteous. Ellie waited, until he was close, until his attention was divided, until she could reach the knife he wore at his belt. Then she moved with the violence children learn when adults prove themselves threats. She stabbed him, not fatally but enough to create distance, to give her seconds to run. David pursued her through the restaurant, then through the connected buildings, the hunter and the hunted reversing roles. He was larger, stronger, more experienced in violence, but Ellie was desperate, fighting for life and agency in a world that had tried to take both since birth. She led him through rooms and corridors, setting traps, using her size to access spaces he could not, gradually wearing him down through accumulated small injuries and her own ferocity. They ended in the restaurant's main dining room. David had her cornered, or thought he did. He was talking, still trying to convert her with words, even as he prepared to take by force what he could not obtain through manipulation. He spoke about inevitability, about submission, about how she could accept and survive or resist and die. Ellie found the cleaver. It was large, heavy, designed for butchering animals or, in this community's case, butchering humans. She gripped it with both hands as David approached. He was still talking, still convinced that his size and strength made the outcome certain. He reached for her. Ellie swung the cleaver with every ounce of strength and fury she possessed. It caught David in the face, in the neck, in the chest as she swung again and again. She did not stop when he fell, did not stop when he ceased moving, did not stop until her arms could no longer lift the weapon, until David was unrecognizable as human, until the floor was painted red with violence that was self-defense but felt like something else, something darker, something that could not be taken back. She stood over David's corpse, breathing hard, covered in blood, the cleaver finally falling from her hands. Around her, the dashed restaurant was silent, except for her ragged breathing. She had won. She had survived. She had killed someone who deserved killing. But the victory felt hollow, felt like she had lost something fundamental, some part of herself that could never be recovered. Joel found her there. He had forced himself to move, to follow despite the agony in his abdomen, to track Ellie to the settlement through sheer desperate will. He arrived to find David's people scattered. Some fled when their leader died. Some were dealing with the fire Ellie had started in her escape. He found Ellie in the restaurant, standing over the body, staring at what she had done with eyes that had seen too much. "Ellie," he said softly. She turned to him, and Joel saw in her face the same thing he had seen in the mirror for 20 years. The knowledge that survival required becoming something you had not wanted to become, that protecting yourself meant crossing lines you could not uncross, that innocence was a casualty of staying alive. "It's okay," Joel said, moving toward her despite the pain. "It's over. You're okay." "I killed him," Ellie said. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion because emotion was too large to contain. "I killed him, and I didn't stop. I just kept. He was going to kill you. You survived. That's what matters." "Is it?" Ellie looked at her hands, at David's blood coating her skin. "I'm covered in someone's blood, and you're telling me that's okay? That surviving makes it okay?" Joel recognized the question, had asked it himself 20 years ago, after the things he had done in those first terrible months, after the people he had killed, the choices he had made, the lines he had crossed to keep breathing. He had never found an answer that satisfied, had learned to live without satisfaction, to accept that survival came with costs that could not be calculated or justified, only endured. "No," he said honestly. "It's not okay. It's never okay. But you did what you had to do. You survived. And you came back for me when you should have kept running. You saved my life." Ellie looked at him, at this man who had tried to abandon her in Jackson, who had come back, who had gotten wounded protecting her, who understood what she was feeling because he had felt it himself. She moved toward him, and Joel wrapped his arms around her, ignoring the agony in his wound, holding her while she shook with delayed shock and horror at what she had done, at what she had become. They stood in that slaughterhouse because that is what it was, a place designed for reducing living things to meat. And Joel understood with perfect clarity that Ellie was no longer the cargo he had picked up in Boston. She was something else, someone he would die to protect, someone whose survival mattered more than his own, someone who had become, despite his efforts to prevent it, despite his knowledge that caring was weakness, as close to a daughter as he would ever have again. The realization was terrifying, was vulnerability he had sworn never to accept again, was opening himself to the same loss that had destroyed him 20 years ago. But standing in that restaurant, holding Ellie while she processed trauma no child should experience, Joel made a choice that was not quite conscious but was absolute. He would protect her. Whatever it cost, whatever it required, whatever he had to become or do or sacrifice. Her life mattered more than the world. It was love. It was also damnation. But Joel had learned long ago that in this world, sometimes they were the same thing. They left the settlement, walking through snow that was falling more heavily now, covering David's community in white that made everything look clean and new. Ellie was quiet, withdrawn into herself, processing something that would take years to fully understand. Joel walked beside her, still wounded but functional, pain managed through sheer will and the knowledge that she needed him alive. They continued west, toward Salt Lake City, toward the Fireflies, toward the cure that might exist or might be delusion. Joel no longer cared particularly about the cure. He cared about getting Ellie through this journey alive, about making sure she survived long enough to have a future, whatever that future might be. They reached Salt Lake City in late spring. The city was partially flooded, the result of water systems failing and rivers overflowing their management, turning downtowns into wetlands where nature and ruins merged into something strange and almost beautiful. They navigated through flooded streets, past buildings where trees grew from upper stories, through neighborhoods reclaimed by wildlife. The Fireflies' location was a hospital on the city's outskirts, still functional according to Tommy's information, still conducting research toward the cure that had been promised for 20 years. Joel and Ellie approached cautiously, watching for patrols, uncertain what reception to expect. They had to pass through a tunnel, flooded and dark, to reach the hospital. Joel went first, Ellie following, both wading through water that was chest-deep and cold. The tunnel was long, disorienting in the darkness. Joel kept talking to Ellie, making sure she was still behind him, still okay. Then the current caught her. She went under, thrashing, pulled by water flow into the tunnel's depths. Joel dove after her, found her in the darkness, pulled her to the surface. But she was not breathing, was unconscious, possibly drowning. Joel performed CPR, breathing for her, forcing water from her lungs, refusing to let her die when they were this close. When the journey was almost over, he breathed and compressed and breathed again, automatic motions driven by desperate need. Not again. Not another daughter dying while he held her. Not this time. Ellie coughed, sputtered, vomited water, breathed, lived. Joel held her while she recovered, while her breathing steadied, while the terror of almost losing her faded into relief. They sat in that flooded tunnel, both soaked and cold, and Joel understood that somewhere in the months of travel, this girl had become the most important thing in his world. More important than survival, more important than himself. They emerged from the tunnel to find Fireflies waiting. Marlene was there, older than when Joel had last seen her in Boston, worn by years of leading a failing rebellion. She looked at Ellie with something between hope and regret, looked at Joel with recognition of what he had become to this girl and what that would mean for what came next. "We'll take her from here," Marlene said. "You did good, Joel. You got her across the country. We can handle the rest." Joel was about to respond when unconsciousness took him. Exhaustion and the wound that had never fully healed, finally claiming their due. He collapsed, aware of Fireflies moving forward, of Ellie calling his name, of being lifted and carried. His last conscious thought was that he had fulfilled the promise to Tess. He had delivered Ellie to the Fireflies. He had done what he had set out to do. He woke in a hospital room, clean and sterile, with Marlene standing at the door. She explained what he had been too unconscious to understand. The Fireflies had taken Ellie immediately to surgery. The doctors believed they could create a cure from her immunity, could synthesize a vaccine that might save humanity. Finally, after 20 years, hope was real. Then she explained the cost, creating the cure required, removing the cordyceps growth from Ellie's brain. The surgery would kill her. There was no other way. To save humanity, Ellie had to die. Marlene watched Joel process this information, watched him understand that the girl he had protected across a continent, the girl who had become as close to a daughter as he would ever have again, the girl who mattered more to him than the world itself, was currently on an operating table where doctors were preparing to kill her to harvest the cure she carried. It's what she would want, Marlene said. To matter, to make her life mean something, to save the world. Joel looked at Marlene, at this woman who had sent him on this journey, who had known from the beginning what the cost would be, who was asking him to accept losing Ellie for the greater good. He thought about Tess, about her sacrifice at the Capitol building, about her belief that Ellie's cure could save humanity. He thought about the billions who had died, about the millions who still lived in quarantine zones or survivor settlements, struggling day by day. He thought about the infected, about the endless war against the fungus that had destroyed civilization. He thought about what the cure would mean. Hope, future, possibility of rebuilding something better. Then he thought about Ellie, about her joke book and her sketches and her questions about the world before, about how she had kept him alive when he was wounded, had survived. David's community had become something more than cargo, about how she was 14 years old and had never consented to dying, had never been asked if she wanted to give her life for a cure she might not believe was worth the price. Joel made his decision. It was not rational. It was not logical. It was not defensible by any utilitarian calculus that weighed individual life against humanity's survival. It was primal, absolute, the same instinct that had made him try to protect Sarah even when protection was impossible, amplified by 20 years of loss and hardened by the understanding that he could not lose another daughter. He was going to save Ellie. Even if it meant dooming humanity, even if it meant killing everyone who stood between him and her, even if it meant becoming monster in service of saving one girl who mattered more to him than the species itself. "Where is she?" Joel asked. Marlene saw the decision in his eyes, saw what he was about to do, tried to appeal to reason, to morality, to the greater good, tried to make him understand that billions of lives weighed more than one girl's, that humanity's survival justified sacrifice, that Ellie herself would choose to die if given the option. But Joel was already moving. What followed was not battle, it was massacre. There are moments that define us not by what we choose to become, but by what we refuse to lose. In those moments, morality becomes secondary to something more fundamental, the primal need to protect what we love, even if that protection damns us, even if the world itself hangs in the balance. Joel moved through St. Mary's Hospital like death incarnate. He was methodical. He was ruthless. He was everything 20 years of survival had taught him to be, amplified by desperation and love twisted into violence. The Fireflies had made a calculation. One girl's life against humanity's survival. Joel made a different calculation. Ellie's life against everything else. There was no contest. The hospital's lower floors fell quickly. Guards who had been told to watch for infected, not for a man willing to become monster to save his daughter. Joel used stealth when possible, violence when necessary, and did not distinguish between the two beyond tactical efficiency. Each Firefly he encountered was obstacle between him and Ellie, and obstacles were eliminated. He took their weapons, their ammunition, their radio to track where Ellie was being held. He moved up through the hospital, leaving bodies in his wake, painting walls with the blood of people who thought they were saving humanity, who could not understand that some loves are larger than species survival, that some bonds matter more than abstract futures. The surgical floor was defended more heavily. Fireflies who understood what they were protecting, who believed the cure justified any cost, including killing one immune girl and anyone who tried to stop them. They made their stand outside the operating rooms, behind barricades and defensive positions that might have stopped a small army. Joel was not a small army. He was a father who had already lost one daughter and refused to lose another. He was relentless in ways that overwhelmed their preparations. He used their tactics against them, thrown explosives, flanking maneuvers, the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades spent becoming very, very good at killing. The Fireflies died believing they were martyrs. Joel did not care what they believed. He reached the operating room where Ellie lay unconscious on the table, already prepped for surgery, already being positioned for the procedure that would extract her brain, and with it, the cordyceps growth that made her immune. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, masked and gloved, preparing to kill her in service of saving millions. Joel burst through the doors, rifle raised. The medical staff froze, understanding immediately that protocol had failed catastrophically, that the asset they were about to harvest was being stolen by someone willing to kill them all. The lead surgeon, a man who had spent years searching for this moment, who had believed he would be remembered as humanity's savior, tried to negotiate, to explain, to make Joel understand what he was destroying. Joel shot him, not to wound, not to disable, to kill, because this man had been seconds away from cutting into Ellie's skull, from ending her life without her consent, from making her sacrifice for a cure she had never agreed to provide. The other medical staff backed away, hands raised, begging. Joel did not shoot them, did not need to. They were no longer threat, no longer obstacle, just people watching their hope die with their colleague. Joel disconnected Ellie from the monitors, from the IV, from the machines that had been keeping her unconscious. He lifted her, still deeply sedated, and carried her from the operating room, through the surgical floor, toward the hospital's exit. She was light in his arms, too light, reminded him of Sarah's weight when he had carried her that final time. But Ellie was alive. Ellie would stay alive. That was all that mattered. Marlene intercepted him in the parking garage. She was wounded, had tried to stop Joel earlier, had been shot but not killed, had dragged herself to this final confrontation. She had known Joel for years, had worked with him in Boston before the journey began, had thought she understood what kind of man he was. She had been wrong. She had not understood the depths of what he would do to protect someone he loved. "Please," Marlene said, voice strained from pain and desperation. "She's our cure. She's humanity's only chance. You're condemning everyone, billions of people, to save one girl. How is that right? How can you justify that?" Joel looked at Marlene, at this woman who led the Fireflies, who had dedicated 20 years to finding hope in the apocalypse, who believed so deeply in the cause that she was willing to sacrifice a child to achieve it. He understood her perspective, understood the logic, understood that by any rational measure, by any utilitarian calculus, she was right and he was wrong. "I'm not justifying it," Joel said. "I'm just doing it." He shot Marlene. Twice. Center mass. Efficient. Final. She fell in the parking garage. Her last thoughts probably about the cure dying with her, about humanity's hope ending because one man loved one girl more than he loved the species. Joel carried Ellie to a vehicle, placed her gently in the passenger seat, drove away from St. Mary's Hospital, from the Fireflies, from the cure that might have saved humanity. Behind him, the survivors would find the bodies, would count their dead, would understand that their last best hope had been stolen by someone they had trusted to deliver it. They would tell themselves Joel was monster, was selfish, was the villain in humanity's story. They would be right. Ellie woke hours later, groggy from sedation, confused about where she was. They were driving through Utah, heading back toward Wyoming, toward Jackson, toward safety and normalcy and life continuing beyond the mission that had defined months of their existence. "What happened?" Ellie asked. Her voice was rough, uncertain. "I was in the tunnel. And then where are we? Did we find the Fireflies?" Joel lied. It was perhaps the kindest and cruelest thing he had ever done. He told her raiders had attacked the hospital, that the fireflies were all dead or scattered, that there had been dozens of immune people tested, and none of them produced viable cure. He told her the doctors had given up, that immunity was too rare to synthesize, that humanity would have to survive without vaccine or cure. He told her everything except the truth, that she had been about to die, that he had killed to save her, that the cure was real and possible, and he had destroyed it. Ellie looked at him, searching his face for something truth, maybe, or confirmation, or permission to believe. Joel met her gaze without flinching, the lie smooth and practiced, delivered with the same flat affect he used for any factual statement. He had become very good at lying over 20 years. This lie was just one more, even if it was the most important he had ever told. "Okay," Ellie said finally. She turned to look out the window at Utah's red rock landscape passing by, at the beauty of a world that continued regardless of human concerns. She did not quite believe him. Joel could see doubt in her posture, in the way she held herself, but she chose to accept the lie, or at least to let it stand unchallenged. For now, they drove back to Jackson, back to Tommy and his wife Maria, to the settlement that functioned without military dictatorship, to the community that had built something resembling civilization from Apocalypse's ruins. Tommy looked at Joel with questions that went unasked. Had seen the blood on his clothes, the expression that suggested violence, had occurred. The way Ellie stayed close to Joel with a dependence that had not existed before. But Tommy did not ask. Perhaps he did not want to know. Perhaps he understood that some truths were better left unexamined, that Joel had made a choice and would live with its consequences, and that pressing for details would only make complicity explicit. Jackson welcomed them. Not as returning heroes, the Fireflies' mission had failed. The cure remained impossible, but as survivors who had completed a difficult journey and deserved rest. They were given a house, modest but functional, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that had running water and electricity from the dam. They were given work assignments integrated into the community's labor systems. They were given the opportunity to stop moving, to stop surviving by inches, to actually live. For a while, it seemed possible. Joel took to Jackson's rhythms with the awkwardness of someone who had spent 20 years in motion. He worked construction, using the skills from his life before the outbreak, building and repairing structures for a community that believed in tomorrow. He learned to drink coffee in the morning without checking exits and sightlines. He attended community gatherings, sat through movie nights where films from before played on salvaged projectors, listened to music played by people who remembered how. He existed in Jackson not as smuggler or killer, but as resident, as member of something larger than himself. He taught Ellie guitar. It was perhaps the most domestic thing he had done in 20 years. Sitting with her on the porch of their Jackson house, showing her how to position her fingers on strings, how to form chords, how to find rhythm. The guitar he used was not his. His had been lost or sold years ago, but someone in Jackson had found one, and Joel had reclaimed a skill he thought he had abandoned with his old life. Ellie was not naturally gifted, but she was persistent, practicing until her fingers developed calluses, until chords started connecting into something resembling music. She would play the same song repeatedly, adjusting fingering based on Joel's corrections, never complaining about the repetition. Sometimes Joel would join her, their guitars in rough harmony, 2 people making music in the apocalypse, creating beauty from strings and wood and the space between them. These were good years, 4 of them, stretching into the longest period of peace Joel had known since Sarah's death. He watched Ellie grow from 14 to 18, watched her develop into someone who could navigate Jackson's social complexities, who made friends and enemies and relationships that had nothing to do with survival. She drew constantly sketches of people and places and infected art as processing of trauma she rarely spoke about directly. She dated occasionally, awkwardly, with the confusion of someone learning romance, in a world where death was always proximate. She still had nightmares. Joel heard her sometimes in the night, crying out, and he would stand outside her door, uncertain if intrusion would help or harm, settling usually for presence without engagement. She never spoke about the nightmare's content, but Joel suspected they featured the restaurant, David, the cleaver she had used to survive. Trauma did not heal simply because circumstances improved. It persisted, incorporated, became part of who you were. Joel had his own nightmares. Sarah, still, even after 24 years. Tess, burning in the Capitol building. Henry and Sam in Pittsburgh. The fireflies he had killed in the hospital. The doctors whose only crime was believing the cure justified sacrifice. But mostly he dreamed of Ellie dying on that operating table, of arriving too late, of making the wrong choice and losing her the way he had lost Sarah. He woke from these dreams with the terrible certainty that he had doomed humanity to save one girl, that his love was selfish, monstrous, that future generations would die from infections that could have been cured if he had let Ellie die. But then morning would come, and he would hear Ellie moving in the other room, alive and growing and making terrible jokes from her worn book, and the certainty would fade. Not disappear, the guilt never fully disappeared but become bearable. The lie stood between them, unacknowledged but present. Ellie never asked directly if Joel had told the truth about the hospital, about the cure, about what had really happened in Salt Lake City. But sometimes she would look at him with an expression that suggested questions she did not voice, doubts she chose not to explore. Joel never offered truth unsolicited. The lie was easier. The lie let them continue. The lie protected them both from confronting what he had done. Jackson prospered during those 4 years. The community expanded, built new structures, cleared more infected zones around the perimeter, established trade with other settlements. Children were born who would never remember the outbreak, who would grow up in a world where walls and guns and patrols were normal. But the horror of civilization's collapse was just story. Humanity was adapting, learning to survive in the world the infection had created, building something that resembled society, even if it would never match what had been lost. Tommy and Maria had a child, a boy they named after a relative who had died in the outbreak. Joel watched his brother navigate fatherhood with the terror and joy of someone who understood exactly how fragile children were in this world, how easily they could be lost, how precious every moment was. Tommy was a better father than Joel had been able to be, present, patient, capable of softness that Joel had trained himself out of. But sometimes Tommy would look at Joel with understanding that required no words. They were both fathers, trying to protect children in a world designed to kill them. Ellie developed her own place in Jackson's community. She volunteered for patrols, clearing infected nests in the areas surrounding the settlement, proving herself capable and reliable. She worked in the gardens, in the stables, in the various labor pools that kept Jackson functioning. She was liked, mostly, though her intensity and occasional darkness made some people uncomfortable. She carried weight that most 18-year-olds did not, had seen and done things that changed people in ways that did not easily integrate with normalcy. But she was alive. She was growing. She was becoming someone independent of Joel, someone with her own relationships and interests and future. This was what Joel had saved her for, not cargo to be delivered, but person to become herself, whatever that self might be. He watched her development with pride, mixed with the growing awareness that she no longer needed him the way she had during their cross-country journey, that the bond forged in survival was evolving into something else, something less necessary but perhaps more meaningful. Movie nights in Jackson became ritual. The community would gather in the theater building, watch films from before the outbreak, share popcorn and commentary, and the collective memory of a world that no longer existed. Joel and Ellie attended together sometimes, sitting in the back row, not quite participating but not quite isolating either. Ellie loved the movies, loved seeing the world before, understanding what had been lost, imagining what life had been like when travel was easy and food was abundant and infection was something antibiotics cured. Joel watched the movies, but mostly watched Ellie, watched her face in the projector's light. He watched her react to stories about people whose problems seemed trivial compared to survival, but which had once been the full extent of human concern. He saw in those moments the childhood she had been denied, the normalcy she craved, the possibility of life beyond constant threat. He had given her that possibility by saving her in Salt Lake City. He tried to let that justify what he had destroyed. But the past, as it always does, eventually arrived to collect payment for choices made. Abby came to Jackson in winter, 4 years after Joel had killed her father. She was 28 years old, a soldier with the Washington Liberation Front, a woman whose life had been defined by a single moment, finding her father dead in St. Mary's Hospital, his blood pooling on the operating room floor, his dream of curing humanity destroyed by a man who valued one girl more than millions. She had learned Joel's name, had learned he had survived, had learned where he lived, and she had come with a group of WLF soldiers to deliver justice or revenge. The difference was perspective. They found Joel and Tommy on patrol outside Jackson's walls. It was bad luck, or perhaps inevitability. Joel was older now, less vigilant than he had been, softened slightly by 4 years of domestic life. He and Tommy had been tracking a moose, clearing infected from a particular route, doing the routine work of maintaining the buffer zone that kept Jackson safe. They had become comfortable with patterns, with the assumption that Jackson was haven rather than target. Abby's group ambushed them, outnumbered them, overpowered them through coordination and surprise. They took Joel and Tommy to an abandoned mansion on Jackson's outskirts, a place that had once been wealthy estate and was now just ruin like everything else humanity had built. They had been planning this for months, tracking Joel's movements, learning Jackson's patrol patterns, waiting for opportunity. Tommy escaped in the initial chaos, managed to slip away and run for help. But Joel was captured, bound, brought before Abby and her companions in the mansion's main room. They formed a circle around him, these soldiers who had travelled hundreds of miles for this moment, who had lost their leader and father and friend to this man's violence 4 years ago. Abby looked at Joel with hatred that was pure and absolute. She explained who she was, whose daughter, why she was here. Joel listened without protest, without defense. He understood, had known since leaving Salt Lake City that consequences would eventually arrive, had killed dozens of Fireflies to save Ellie, had destroyed their cure, had eliminated their leadership. Of course someone had survived. Of course they had come for revenge. Of course they had found him. Ellie arrived as Abby was beating Joel with a golf club. She had heard the gunshots, had tracked the sounds to the mansion, had arrived in time to see Joel on the ground, bloodied and broken, while Abby brought the club down repeatedly with methodical fury. Ellie screamed, tried to intervene, was held back by Abby's companions. She was forced to watch, helpless, as the man who had saved her, who had chosen her life over humanity's cure, who had lied to protect her from the weight of that choice, was murdered before her eyes. The golf club descended. Joel's skull cracked. Blood spread across the mansion's floor, pooling the way Abby's father's blood had pooled in the operating room 4 years earlier. The cycle of violence continued, perfect in its symmetry, teaching again what it had always taught. Revenge creates revenge without end. Ellie's scream was inhuman, animal, the sound of something fundamental breaking. She had lost Riley to infection, had lost Sam in Pittsburgh, had lost whatever innocence remained in David's restaurant. But Joel had been constant, had been the one person who stayed, who protected, who chose her when the world demanded otherwise. And now he was gone, beaten to death while she watched helplessly, unable to save him the way he had saved her. Abby left. Let Ellie live. Let Tommy live. She had come for Joel, not for massacre, not for eliminating everyone he cared about. She had delivered her revenge and considered her father avenged. She did not understand that in leaving survivors, she had created the same cycle that had brought her to Jackson, that Ellie and Tommy would carry the same drive for revenge that had driven her, that the violence would continue because violence always continued. Jackson mourned Joel. He had been there only 4 years, had kept himself somewhat apart, had never fully integrated in the way Tommy had, but he had contributed to the community, had taught some people construction, had existed among them as someone reliable even if not warm. His death was felt as loss, as reminder that the world beyond walls remained dangerous, that the apocalypse did not respect safe zones or domestic happiness. For Ellie, it was devastation absolute. Joel had been her father in every way that mattered, had protected her across a continent, had given up the world's cure to keep her alive, had built a life with her in Jackson where she could grow beyond mere survival. He had been flawed, had lied to her, had made terrible choices, had killed for reasons she suspected but did not fully know, but he had been hers, had been constant, had been love in a world mostly empty of it. His body was prepared for burial according to Jackson's rituals, cleaned, wrapped, eulogized by Tommy, with words that tried to capture a complicated man. Brother, smuggler, survivor, father, to a girl who was not biologically his, but who he had chosen anyway. Ellie stood silent throughout, face hard, tears refused, rage building in the place where grief should have been. Because grief was luxury she could not afford. Grief meant accepting loss as final. Grief meant moving forward. Grief meant letting Joel rest. Ellie could not let him rest. She had found a map in the mansion, dropped by one of Abby's companions. Seattle, the Washington Liberation Front. Names written in margins, places marked, evidence of where they had come from and where they would return. Abby thought she was finished. Thought revenge completed meant freedom from the past. But Ellie was just beginning. She stood over Joel's grave after the burial, after the community had dispersed, after Tommy had returned to his wife and child. She stood alone with the earth that covered the man who had saved her, and she made a promise that was also a curse. She would find Abby. She would make Abby suffer. She would deliver revenge for revenge, continue the cycle Joel had inadvertently started by saving one girl over humanity, prove that love created violence as surely as hatred did. "I'm going to find her," Ellie whispered to the grave. "I'm going to make her pay. I promise." It was love speaking. It was also the voice of someone about to destroy themselves in pursuit of revenge, about to learn what Joel had known for 24 years, that surviving without the people you love is just extended death, that violence begets violence begets violence, that some debts cannot be paid because payment only creates more debt. But Ellie could not see that yet, could only see Joel's broken body, Abby's face twisted in fury, the golf club descending, could only feel rage that was pure and total and blinding, that made revenge seem not just necessary but righteous, not just desire but obligation. Jackson continued around her. Life went on because life always went on, indifferent to individual grief. But Ellie was already gone, already traveling in her mind toward Seattle, toward the WLF, toward Abby, and the confrontation that would define her as surely as Salt Lake City had defined Joel. The cycle continued. Love became violence, became love, became violence, spiraling forever, unless someone chose to break it. But breaking required strength Ellie did not yet possess, wisdom that only came from walking the path to its bitter end. She would have to walk it first. would have to become what revenge made of people, would have to lose everything to understand what Joel had known, that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat, that saving the people you love sometimes means damning yourself, that in the world the outbreak created, there were no heroes, only survivors, trying desperately to protect the few things that made survival worthwhile. The winter continued. Snow fell on Jackson, on Joel's grave, on Ellie standing vigil in the cold. The world turned indifferent to human pain, as it always had, as it always would. The storm was just beginning. Consider the nature of revenge. It promises justice, but delivers only continuation. It promises closure, but creates only new wounds. It promises that violence can somehow erase violence, that blood can wash away blood, that destroying the person who destroyed you will restore what was lost. It is a seductive lie, and we believe it because the alternative, accepting that loss is permanent, that some debts cannot be repaid, that moving forward means leaving the dead behind, is unbearable. Ellie believed the lie with the totality that comes from grief too large to contain. She left Jackson in spring with Dina and Jesse, two friends who agreed to help her pursue revenge because they cared about her and understood that some needs override reason. Tommy came too, separately, driven by his own rage at his brother's murder, his own need to deliver justice or revenge or whatever word made the violence feel righteous. They travelled to Seattle with maps and names and the righteous fury of people who believed their cause justified the horror they would inflict. Seattle was a war zone. The Washington Liberation Front controlled the eastern districts, a military organization that had overthrown Fedra and established their own dictatorship, pragmatic and ruthless in their governance. The Seraphites controlled the islands and forests, a religious cult that had rejected technology and returned to pre-industrial living, equally ruthless but cloaked in spiritual justification. They fought constantly, territory, changing hands through violence that benefited neither side but which neither could stop because stopping meant losing, and losing meant death. Into this war, Ellie brought her personal mission. She had Abby's companions' names, had locations where they operated, had the focused determination of someone who had reduced life's complexity to a single goal. Find Abby, make her suffer, deliver revenge. Everything else, survival, morality, the humanity she was destroying in herself with each act of violence, was secondary. The Seattle campaign was brutal. Ellie moved through the city killing WLF soldiers who had nothing to do with Joel's death, who were simply guards and patrols doing their jobs, who became obstacles to eliminate rather than people to consider. She tortured for information, extracting Abby's location through methods that horrified Dina, that made Jesse question whether they should continue, that transformed Ellie from victim seeking justice into perpetrator of the same violence she claimed to oppose. Each of Abby's companions died according to Ellie's meticulous plan. She tracked them, learned their patterns, struck when they were vulnerable. She killed them not quickly, but with the drawn-out cruelty of someone who wanted them to understand what they had taken from her, who needed them to suffer as Joel had suffered, who believed their pain could somehow balance the cosmic injustice of his death. But pain does not balance. Violence does not restore. Each kill hardened Ellie further, pushed her deeper into the darkness. Joel had spent 24 years inhabiting, proved what he had known but she had not yet learned. Revenge does not heal wounds. It creates them in yourself, in your soul, in the person you are becoming with each act justified by the last. Dina stayed with her through the campaign, watched Ellie transform from the girl she loved into something frightening, someone driven by rage beyond reason or mercy. Jesse died trying to protect them both, shot by a WLF soldier during an ambush, another casualty of Ellie's mission, another person destroyed by the cycle she was perpetuating. Tommy was maimed, lost an eye, suffered injuries that would disable him permanently, survived only because Ellie was there to pull him away from death. The cost accumulated, but Ellie continued because stopping meant accepting that Joel had died for nothing, that the revenge she had promised him was impossible, that moving forward required letting go. She could not let go, could not accept, could only push forward through the horror she was creating, believing somehow that Abby's death would make everything right, would restore meaning, would allow her to return to herself. She found Abby at the theatre the WLF used as base, cornered her after days of hunting, ready to deliver the revenge she had travelled across a country to achieve. But Abby was not alone. She had Lev, a young Seraphite boy she had saved and protected, who had become to her what Ellie had been to Joel, someone worth protecting beyond reason, someone whose life justified any sacrifice. The confrontation in the theatre was everything cycles of revenge create. Two women, each having lost someone they loved, each believing the other deserved death, each incapable of seeing that they were mirrors, that Abby's revenge on Joel was identical in structure to Ellie's revenge on Abby, that neither was more justified than the other, because revenge is never justified, it is only continued. They fought with the viciousness of people who had nothing left to lose. Ellie nearly killed Abby, should have killed Abby, had her helpless, beaten, ready for the execution that would complete the mission. But Lev was there, this child pleading for his protector's life, and Ellie saw in Lev's face what she must have looked like in Salt Lake City when Joel saved her. Saw the cycle clearly for a moment. Kill Abby, and Lev becomes the next person seeking revenge, continues the spiral forever. But Tommy arrived before Ellie could process this understanding. Shot and wounded Abby, made the choice Ellie was hesitating over, forced them all into a Mexican standoff where Jesse died, where Tommy was maimed, where Dina was held at gunpoint by Abby, who was herself wounded and desperate. Everyone had weapons pointed at everyone else. One trigger pull would cascade into mutual destruction. Abby let them live, took Lev and left, disappearing into Seattle's chaos, choosing survival over revenge, even though she could have killed them all. She had achieved her revenge on Joel. She had no interest in Ellie or Tommy, or continuing a cycle that had already cost her most of her friends. She wanted it to be over, wanted to protect Lev the way Joel had protected Ellie, wanted to stop being the person revenge had made her. Ellie returned to Jackson maimed but alive. Tommy survived but damaged. Dina survived but traumatized. The revenge was incomplete, but the cost was total. Everything they had brought to Seattle, their innocence, their relationships, their belief that violence could solve anything, was destroyed. They had become killers in service of justice that never arrived, had sacrificed their humanity for revenge that brought no satisfaction. For a time, Ellie tried to move forward. She and Dina established a farm outside Jackson, tried to build domestic life far from the violence, tried to create peace through isolation. They had a son, JJ, a child born into a world slightly safer than the one Ellie had been born into, someone who represented future rather than past. Ellie tried to be present, to be partner to Dina and parent to JJ, to let Joel's death become memory rather than mission. But the trauma persisted. Ellie had PTSD from Seattle, from Joel's death, from the violence she had inflicted and witnessed. She had flashbacks to the mansion, to Joel's murder, to the faces of people she had killed. She could not play guitar properly. Any more 2 fingers on her left hand permanently damaged from torture she had endured. The music that had connected her to Joel was now a reminder of what she had lost, what she had destroyed, what could never be recovered. Tommy arrived at the farm with poison, information about where Abby was, Santa Barbara, a lead on her location. The demand that Ellie finish what they had started, that she complete the revenge that Tommy could no longer achieve himself due to his injuries. He played on her guilt, on her love for Joel, on her inability to let go, and Ellie, broken by trauma and guilt and the weight of incompletion, made the choice that would cost her everything remaining. She left, abandoned Dina and JJ and the domestic peace she had tried to build, traveled to California pursuing a woman she had already defeated, already let live, already proven she could not kill without becoming someone she could not bear to be. But the cycle was stronger than reason. The need for revenge was stronger than love for the living. The debt to Joel was stronger than the future she was destroying. Santa Barbara was hell. The Rattlers, a slaver clan, controlled the coastline, capturing survivors and using them as forced labor, as entertainment, as commodities to be worked until death. Abby and Lev had been captured months earlier, were barely alive when Ellie found them, crucified on poles by the beach, skeletal from starvation and exposure, reduced to the edge of death by people who had no connection to Joel or Ellie or any of the revenge that had brought them all to this point. Ellie freed them, cut them down, gave them water. She could have left then, could have walked away and let the revenge die with Abby's suffering, let the cycle end through mercy. But she had traveled too far, sacrificed too much, become too committed to the mission. She forced Abby to fight her, held a knife to Lev's throat to make Abby comply, demonstrated that she had become exactly the kind of person Joel had been in the hospital, willing to threaten children to achieve her goal. They fought in the surf, the Pacific Ocean red with their blood, two women destroying each other over a death that had happened a year ago, over a cycle that had started 4 years before that, when Joel chose Ellie's life over humanity's cure. They fought with the exhaustion of people who had nothing left, who were continuing through momentum rather than genuine desire, who knew somewhere deep that winning would feel exactly like losing. Ellie had Abby beaten, held her underwater, felt her struggles weaken, was seconds from drowning her, from completing the revenge she had pursued across 2 states and countless bodies. Her fingers were on Abby's throat. The woman who had killed Joel was about to die. Justice was imminent. Then Ellie saw Joel, not present dead, a year in the ground in Jackson, but memory. Joel on the porch teaching her guitar, Joel reading her joke book with almost smiles, Joel choosing her life when the world demanded her death. Joel protecting her because she mattered more than anything, because some loves are worth damnation, because being someone's whole world is both beautiful and terrible. And she saw what Joel had never fully understood, that revenge had cost him everything, that choosing violence over the cure had damned humanity, that saving her in Salt Lake City had set in motion the cycle that killed him in Jackson. That love expressed through violence creates only more violence, spiraling forever, destroying everyone who participates. Ellie let go. She released Abby's throat, let her swim away, coughing and gasping, crawling toward Lev, who waited on the beach. She did not explain, did not justify, just let go of the revenge that had defined her for a year, that had cost her Jesse and Tommy's health and her relationship with Dina and Two Fingers, and whatever humanity she had retained after David's restaurant. Abby and Lev left, took a boat toward Catalina Island, where the Fireflies supposedly had established a new base, where they might find safety and purpose and freedom from the cycles that had consumed their lives. They did not thank Ellie, did not forgive her, just left, understanding that survival sometimes means running from people who might change their mind about mercy. Ellie returned to the farm to find it empty. Dina had left, had taken JJ and returned to Jackson, had decided that she could not wait indefinitely for someone who kept choosing revenge over family, death over life, the past over the present. The house was abandoned, possessions mostly gone, silence replacing the domestic sounds that had filled it. Ellie sat in the empty house and tried to play guitar. The chords Joel had taught her, the songs they had practiced together, but her fingers would not cooperate, damaged permanently by the torture she had endured, unable to form the shapes required for music. She tried repeatedly, failing each time, until she finally set the guitar aside and simply sat in the silence of the home she had destroyed. The cost was complete. Joel dead, Jessie dead, her relationship with Dina destroyed, Tommy maimed and consumed by bitterness, two fingers gone, the ability to play music gone. Everything she had possessed before Seattle was ashes. The revenge she had pursued had delivered exactly what revenge always delivers. Nothing but continuation of suffering, payment in full for violence, with more violence. The cycle unbroken because she had learned too late that breaking it required letting go. But she had let go. Finally, at the edge of the Pacific, with Abby's life in her hands, she had chosen to break the cycle rather than continue it. She had chosen to be something Joel had never quite managed. To be someone who could walk away from revenge, who could let the debt remain unpaid, who could accept that some losses could not be avenged, because vengeance created only more loss. It was too late to save what she had destroyed. But it was not too late to stop destroying, to step off the path revenge had put her on, to become someone who could exist without defining themselves through violence. Ellie left the farm. The guitar stayed behind, a relic of a connection that could no longer be expressed through music, but which existed nonetheless, deeper than chords or songs, rooted in the choice Joel had made in Salt Lake City and the choice Ellie had made in Santa Barbara. Both had chosen mercy over justice, love over logic, individual life over abstract principles. Both had been destroyed by their choices. Both had also, in their way, been saved by them. She walked toward Jackson, toward Dina and JJ, toward the possibility of reconciliation, or at least understanding. She did not know if Dina would take her back, did not know if the relationship could be rebuilt, did not know if she could be the partner and parent she had failed to be before. But she knew she had to try, had to choose life over death, finally and completely, had to prove that the cycle could end, that revenge could be refused, that Joel's sacrifice and Jessie's death and all the violence she had inflicted could somehow, eventually, lead to choosing differently. The world continued around her, indifferent as always. 28 years after the outbreak, humanity persisted in scattered pockets, adapting to permanent apocalypse, building societies that functioned without cure or hope of return to before. The infected remained, would always remain, a permanent feature of Earth's ecology. The cordyceps had won in the most fundamental sense. It had transformed the planet, had reduced human civilization to fragments, had achieved evolutionary success through parasitism perfected. But humans persisted too, in Jackson and settlements like it, in the tentative peace between violence, in the children born who would never know the world before, in the slow accumulation of culture and connection that might, centuries hence, become something resembling civilization again. The species would survive, diminished but present, continuing because continuation is what life does. The cure Joel destroyed would never be developed. The immunity Ellie carried would die with her, unique and irreproducible. A might have been that haunted, but could not be recovered. Humanity would adapt to the infection rather than curing it, would learn to live permanently in crisis, would accept that the golden age of the early 21st century was gone forever and would never return. Was Joel's choice right? The question itself assumes that right and wrong are meaningful categories in a world where survival is the only absolute, where protecting the people you love conflicts with protecting humanity itself, where every choice is triage between impossible options. Joel chose Ellie over the cure. Ellie chose mercy over revenge. Both choices were simultaneously right and wrong, justifiable and monstrous. Love and Ellie, damnation intertwined inseparably. What remains is the legacy. Joel and Ellie's story as testament to what humans become when civilization collapses. They became killers and protectors, monsters and heroes, selfish and selfless, demonstrating that in extremity, moral categories dissolve into simple imperative: protect what you love, survive another day, find meaning in a world designed to strip it away. Their story is ultimately about love in the apocalypse. Not romantic love, though that appears. Not abstract love for humanity, though that is invoked. But specific, particular, irrational love for one person who becomes more important than the world, whose survival justifies any cost, whose loss makes existence itself questionable. It is the love that makes us human, and the love that makes us monsters. The love worth dying for and worth killing for. The love that saves and damns simultaneously. Joel saved Ellie and doomed humanity. Ellie forgave Abby and saved herself. Both were acts of love, imperfect, destructive, irrational, human. Both proved that even in the darkness, even in the horror of permanent crisis, even in a world where the infected wander through ruined cities and humans prey on each other, and hope seems like delusion even there, love persists. It may not save the world. Joel proved that it might destroy the world. But it makes survival worthwhile, makes the struggle meaningful, makes tomorrow worth fighting for, even when logic suggests tomorrow will be worse than today. The last of us, those who survive after everything else has fallen, are not the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. They are the ones who find something worth surviving for, who make connections despite knowing connections make loss inevitable, who choose love even when love costs everything. Joel and Ellie were the last of us, imperfect, broken, guilty of crimes that could never be justified but which made perfect sense in the moments they were committed. They survived 28 years of apocalypse. They found each other against all probability. They destroyed and saved each other repeatedly. They proved that humanity persists not through its best qualities but through its most fundamental, the need to protect what we love, even if that protection damns us. Their story ends where it began, with a choice between one life and many, between love and logic, between the person beside you and the abstract billions you will never meet. Joel chose Ellie. Ellie chose mercy. Both choices were wrong. Both choices were right. Both choices were human. And humanity, diminished but undefeated, continues. Building, surviving, loving, destroying, existing in the space between death and life, between hope and despair, between the world that ended and the world that persists. The last of us, enduring. Because enduring is what we do. It is all we do. It is everything.